Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, the FDA's Missed Opportunity on Endocrine Disrupting Chemicals in Food and Packaging. I'm Dr. Estelle Dish, Board Secretary for the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition is dedicated to preventing environmental causes of breast cancer through community education, research advocacy, and changes to public policy. I am very pleased to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Maricel Maffini. Dr. Maricel Maffini is an independent consultant based in Maryland. She has more than 25 years of research experience in the fields of carcinogenesis and breast cancer, with a focus on reproductive biology and endocrine disruption. For the past 10 years, her work has focused on the safety and regulation of chemicals in food and the decision-making processes behind them. Before becoming a consultant, she was a senior scientist with the Natural Resources Defense Council, a senior science officer at the Pew Charitable Trust, and a research assistant professor at Tufts University School of Medicine. Dr. Maffini, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Estelle, for the introduction. Very kind words. And thank you to the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition for this opportunity. I'm going to talk to you today about how the agency that is in charge of regulating chemicals that get into the food supply has dealt or not with endocrine disrupting chemicals in food. So let's go here. Yes. All right, so very quickly here, we are going to figure out what the definitions of endocrine disruptors are, what FDA regulatory responsibilities are, what the approach they have taken on endocrine disrupting chemicals, some examples of endocrine disruptors that are already allowed in food, and how the regulation of endocrine disruptors could be improved to minimize health impacts. And here I'm disclosing that I work with NGOs and industry. So to start, there are two definitions of endocrine disruptors, each one from the two major agencies that regulate chemicals in commerce in the US. The first definition is from the Environmental Protection Agency, and as you can see, is quite detailed. The endocrine disruptor is a substance, a chemical that, or a mixture of chemicals that actually alters the structure or function of the endocrine system, that causes adverse effects either in the individual, on the progeny, populations, or subpopulations of organisms. And that is a definition that was released in 1998. FDA definition is a little shorter and less detailed, and is coming from the agency's work on systems to identify chemicals that binds to estrogen and androgen receptors. So an endocrine disruptor is a chemical that interferes with the endocrine systems, leading to adverse effects. And some of these chemicals can do this by binding to receptors. As you can see, those are quite different definitions. And that is, as you will see later in the talk, is one of the issues. There are lots of different definitions, and that is one reason why we are where we are with endocrine disruption regulations. So there are many sources of endocrine disrupting chemicals, from pesticides, oil and gas industries also use endocrine disrupting chemicals, industrial operations, of course, food and food packaging, plastics, cosmetics, and the like, pesticides. And on the right-hand side here, you can see some of the health outcomes that have been associated with exposures to endocrine disrupting chemicals, from neurodevelopment all the way to a decrease in bone health. What people don't sometimes associate the endocrine system with is with reproduction, and sometimes with the pancreas because of diabetes. But there are the endocrine system touches pretty much every organ and system in the body. So that's something to keep in mind. There was this recent paper that came out a few weeks ago from a group in Portugal, where they investigated, they looked at 237 studies and identified the associations of endocrine disruptors with specific cancers. They found that breast was the organ that was most studied, and that heavy metals like lead and cadmium and arsenic, PFAS, the fluorinated chemicals, the so-called forever chemicals, and the alkyl phenolic compounds have the highest contribution to breast cancer risk. However, the thyroid gland was the organ that presenting the highest cancer risk after endocrine disruption exposures. So that's a little bit of a background to tell you where we are with some of the latest evidence. Just a reminder of what the food law is in the US. Congress passed a law called the Food Additives Amendment of 1958 that modified the first law for the creation and the structure of the FDA of 1938. So this Food Additives Amendment had the goals of protecting the public, to prohibit the use of substances, additives that have not been tested adequately, and we could not establish their safe uses. This law gave FDA the authority to regulate chemicals that would be used directly in food, like the ingredients that you read in a package, or chemicals that get into food through the uses of manufacturing equipment, through the supply chain, transportation, or that come out from final packaging. What is important here is that the manufacturer of a chemical that will be used in food has the obligation to demonstrate that the use is safe. So the burden is on the manufacturer, it's not on the agency to demonstrate that the use is safe. The system that FDA created is based on risk assessment, and that means that both the toxicity of the chemical and the exposure, the amount that we consume, are balanced. And more importantly, there is a prohibition for chemicals that are known to cause cancer in man or animals, regardless of exposure. That is the only provision that is not based on risk, that is exclusively based on hazard. Now, what does it mean that something is safe? Congress didn't define safe or safety, but FDA did after going through all the conversations, the back and forth that the legislators had before they passed the law in 1958. And it was defined as that there is a reasonable certainty in the minds of competent scientists that the substance is not harmful under the intended conditions of use. And this is important, is the intended condition of use what is safe, not necessarily the chemical substance itself. And the safety assessment, if it is done either by FDA or a manufacturer, must consider, and this was in the Congress wrote these words, this is in the law, the safety assessment must consider whether or not people are consuming these additives, safety factors to take into consideration that most of the data is coming from animals. Animals and humans are different, and there will be some, the data is not going to be correlated directly, so safety factors just to be more protected. And to me, the most important part of the law is here in number 2. The safety assessment has to consider the cumulative effect of the substance in the diet, taking into account any chemically or biologically related substance or substances that are already in the diet. Because if chemicals look alike, it's likely to have similar biological effect. Therefore, you don't want to increase the likelihood that there would be a toxic effect when there are many of those together. But also, there are chemicals that don't look alike, but they do affect the same systems. So we're going to get into that a little bit later. So in the 80s, FDA was a world leader in chemical safety assessment. And they work to put together basically what is the equivalent of a cookbook. It is called Toxicological Principles for the Safety Assessment of Direct Food Additives and Color Additives Used in Food. This book came to be called the Red Book, and it's a series of explanations, protocols on how to do certain studies to identify whether or not there are toxicities for the use of those particular chemicals. Now, at the same time, a group of experts that had been working for 10 years reviewing the safety of hundreds of substances that President Nixon required FDA to do, gave the first warning to the agency about additives that could interfere with the endocrine system. This is, again, in 1982, FDA was recommended to take into consideration that there are additives in the food supply that were actually binding to the estrogen receptor. Now, what did FDA do? They have a whole lot of information for industry on how to test chemicals. And as I said before, this is the Red Book here. This is the list of specific toxicity studies that FDA has protocols for. The agency is not requiring anything from the industry to do. All these are recommendations of what industry could be doing to show that the use of the substances are safe. So of all this, only one is considered a proxy for endocrine disruption testing, and this one here that looks at reproduction and developmental toxicity. There is an additional study here that could be done about immunotoxicity and neurotoxicity, but those are usually not done. And then on the right-hand side here, and I understand this is very small print, but FDA has a system of concern levels. And it is a combination of the chemical structure of the substance and the potential exposure, how much of the substance people will be exposed to. So the chemical structure gives an idea of how toxic it could be, and then the cumulative exposure that gives an idea how much people will be consumed. So FDA has this system of red, yellow, and green, and manufacturers should look into their substances, identify what the exposure would be, and run the tests according to this system. Concern level 1 is the lowest concern level for toxicity, and then concern level 2 and 3 is the worst, where you have, in this case, it could be really bad chemical structure that indicates a high toxicity, or it could be high exposure. I like to use the example of sugar. Sugar doesn't seem to be a very toxic compound, but the exposure is so high that at some point it tips the scale and it becomes a health problem. So based on these concern levels, then the manufacturers go to this table here and they pick the studies that they should be doing, or they could be doing. So at a minimum, all substances that are directly added to food, your emulsifiers, your flavors, your what is the other word? Preservatives, should have a genetic toxicity test, because as I said at the beginning, the law doesn't allow carcinogens to be added to food. And at a minimum, a short-term toxicity test. This is a 28 days feeding the rats with the compound to see what happens. Unfortunately, that is not usually the case. Sometimes they don't even do those things. Now, for chemicals that are used in the manufacturing of packaging or components, or are used as components of processing equipment, FDA has a completely different system. And here is based on thresholds of estimated exposures, and those exposures are estimated by the manufacturer of the substance. So if the manufacturers demonstrate that the substance is not a mutagen, basically it doesn't cause mutations or cause cancer or damage the DNA, and estimates that the exposure will be less than 1.5 micrograms per person per day, FDA is not expecting any data, any safety information from the manufacturer. So if you have some background on endocrine disrupting chemicals, you know that these chemicals don't need to be to use very high amounts to have a profound effect on an individual, because they act like hormones, and hormones are some of the most efficient chemicals that we have in the body. We don't need high amounts of hormones to have a profound effect. So, and then based on different type of exposures that they estimate, they may have to do a genetic toxicity test and then talk to the FDA to see how many other type of studies they should be doing. But this is the key. If their estimate is less than this amount, 1.5 micrograms per person per day, FDA is not expecting any studies. So things like bisphenol A or phthalates or other chemicals that you may have heard are used in packaging, food packaging. If they have this estimate, they have no data. Now, a couple of years later, FDA did its own review of where the agency was when it comes to the safety of chemicals, how they were making those decisions. And that is in part due to work that I was doing at the Pew Charitable Trust with the colleagues there, where we demonstrated that the science that they were using was incredibly outdated. So one of the leaders in the FDA at the time hired a consulting firm to do a complete review of how FDA was evaluating the harmful effect of chemicals, not only food, but others like dietary supplements, cosmetics. And their review included something very interesting, that was to interview the scientists at FDA to see what they were thinking. And this review, all this documentation, you can find it online at an FDA's web pages. They identified these 5 areas of concern. They don't have processes to identify and manage endocrine disruptors. There are data gaps, especially at low doses and low amounts of chemicals that are consumed daily, sometimes in the diet. There's a lack of understanding of how these chemicals could be causing toxicity and chronic effects. There's an inadequate assessment of sensitive populations, and they are not considered mixtures and related chemicals. Something that I mentioned at the beginning is included in the law as a mandate for anybody that does a safety assessment. So here are some of the responses from the FDA scientists to see how they feel about this issue. When they were asked, where do we most need to increase the scope and depth of expertise? Endocrine disruptors, endocrine disruption, things like hormones, endocrine chemistry. We need to move into areas for endocrine disruptors. Is the program risk assessment and safety evaluation methods okay? Well, they are outdated. We have little internal guidance on endocrine disruptors. Low dose hypothesis, that is how endocrine disruptors work, at low doses in unexpected ways. They don't have experience on that. They are not operating under that hypothesis. Again, endocrine disruptors. What do you see as an emerging issue? Emerging, think about this. In 2014, they were still considering endocrine disruption an emerging issue. What do we need? Endocrine disruptor, reevaluate the review process, how to recognize endocrine disruption, how to prevent them to get into the food. So all this is quite revealing of how the agency has sort of stalled and has not been following the science, all the advances that we have had in knowledge, both in knowledge and technologies. So here I will show you a couple of examples. For food contact substances, I'm pretty sure you are aware of the fluorinated chemicals, most of which have endocrine disrupting effects. Bisphenol A, probably one of the most famous endocrine disrupting chemicals. I work with it. We did a lot of experiments on animals, specifically looking at mammary gland biology, how BPA affects the development of the breast and actually increases the likelihood of breast cancer later in life. Phthalates are another very known endocrine disruptors, mostly because they affect the male reproductive system, but also the thyroid gland. Parabens are another example of endocrine disruptors. All this, perchlorate. Perchlorate is rocket fuel. Perchlorate affects the thyroid gland. It basically competes with the iodine that is in the food to enter the thyroid. So all these things are, industrial chemicals that are used in manufacturing of packaging or processing equipment. But I want to show you, and they are usually used or appear in food in small amounts, even though the consequences, the health effects are very important. But I want to show you 3 examples of ingredients. Ingredients are things that you have in the order of milligrams or even grams per serving. When perchlorate and PFAS and BPA, you may have it at the levels of the micrograms of consumption. So this one in particular is soy isoflavone extract. This is an ingredient that is used, or it was submitted to FDA for review to be used in bars, meal replacement beverages, those sort of things at 25 milligrams per serving. And this is a copy from memos, 2 memos from FDA scientists telling the agency, please do not allow this in food. And they said, we oppose the generally recognized as safe status because there is abundant evidence that some of the isoflavones, including genistein and equal, are toxicants. They have estrogenic responses in developing and in adult animals and in adult humans. And they are inhibitors of the thyroid peroxidase, which makes the fundamental hormones T3 and T4. T4 is particularly important during gestation in the first trimester because it is crucial for the development of the baby's brain. So these 2 scientists were telling the agency, please do not allow this in food. And it is in the marketplace. This is another one. This is also sold as a dietary supplement. This was intended to be added to water, fortified water with vitamins, like Gatorade type things at high levels. Basically, what FDA was saying is that this compound, trans-resveratrol, is similar to synthetic estrogens, specifically DES. If you remember, DES is an incredibly potent synthetic estrogen that was the cause of many developmental toxicity in people whose mothers were born to mothers that were given DES during gestation. They were born with no limbs and the like. And they were also they develop cancer when, especially the daughters, develop cancer in the vagina when they were very young. And basically saying that, again, in this sentence here, that resveratrol has a complex estrogenic and anti-estrogenic effect depending on the biological environment. This sounds a lot like tamoxifen, how tamoxifen works in the body. That is an estrogen in some systems and an anti-estrogen in other systems. So the last one is an extract from green tea. Green tea is a fabulous thing, but when people extract a single compound from green tea and sell it as green tea extract when it's just a highly purified single compound, it can cause devastating problems, including what this FDA saw in animals, the testes, pituitary, and thyroid glands were significantly reduced. They have goitrogenic effects, so the thyroid was a very sensitive organ as well. So all these 3 things are in the marketplace, and FDA, as far as I know, have not taken any actions on oversight of those uses. And as I said before, FDA should be doing cumulative effect of chemicals. This is just an example of different chemicals here: phthalates, bisphenol, colors, PFAS, perchlorate, nitrate. All of them, potassium bromate, affect the thyroid gland. All of this should be looked at together as a class of thyroid toxicity chemicals. And it is not happening. It's one chemical at a time. The other problem is that there is no periodic reassessment of chemicals. This is just a quick timeline of what FDA has been doing. And when it comes to reassessment of chemicals that are already in the market, very few things they have done. They banned cyclamates because President Nixon pushed them to do that because of cancer issues in rats. FDA made its own decision that it would ban artificial trans fats. And today they just finalized, and every single use of trans fats, artificial trans fats in food are prohibited. They started the process in like 2005 or something like that. 2015 was the first time they made a determination. And then this other one here at the bottom that is also yellow is something that FDA was also involved. FDA accepted certain companies voluntary phase out of fluorinated chemicals that were used in food packaging. All the blue boxes, FDA acted because of petitions that were submitted by public interest organizations. I was involved in writing pretty much all of them with other groups. This is the way we found to get FDA to review the safety of chemicals using modern science. So this one was on carcinogenic flavors. There is brominated vegetable oil, PFAS, and the like. So there are still some that we lost, some cases like perchlorate. Phthalates we're still litigating in the courts. We have 3 that are still pending that FDA has to resolve. Perchlorate and phthalates are EDCs, PFAS and BPA are EDCs. So this is the way we found to get the agency to move on EDCs. But it is piecemeal and it is very time consuming. And as you can see, you get entangled in court for many years. So with a group of colleagues, we started thinking about how can we think in terms of better regulations of endocrine disrupting chemicals to actually minimize their impact in health. Some of these things are were allowed, approved for uses decades and decades ago. And how can we move forward from here on? What can we propose to agencies, not only FDA, but EPA and others, including agencies in Europe, that they can move on to improve the health of people by better regulating EDCs. So we identified 4 challenges, and this is what I was mentioning at the beginning. There are inconsistencies on what it means to be an endocrine disrupting chemical. There is a consistency on what it means to alter the endocrine system, what an adverse effect is. There are a lot of data gaps that are considered as if there is no data, it means that the chemical is safe. There are issues with continue to accept the mantra that the dose makes the poison, that the higher the amount of chemical exposure, the worse the effect, when we know that that is not how endocrine disrupting chemicals work. This interpretation is not reflecting the principles of endocrinology. The exposures to endocrine disrupting chemicals may produce health effects that takes years to appear. The exposure may have been during development, and we see effects later in life, in puberty, or during pregnancy, or even at the time of menopause. And the last challenge that is a very important one is that there are no really real world exposures and cumulative impacts done. So agencies continue to assess chemicals one by one, and that is not protective enough. So this is I don't expect you to be able to read this, but I want you to just look at the 2 boxes here. That if we, one way to deal with these inconsistencies on definitions and what it means to cause an adverse effect. What we propose is that agencies enforce the mandates that they already have to test for endocrine disrupting properties. This is in particular important for the Environmental Protection Agency that has created, Congress passed a law, the Food Quality Protection Act, that created a whole program to test pesticides for endocrine disruption. And that program has never been implemented. There isn't even one that is functioning at this time. And the Food Quality Protection Act was a law that was passed in 1996. They can restrict the use of known endocrine disrupting chemicals. They can screen for substances. They can encourage coordination between governmental agencies, those that are already doing some screening or mandates for testing, to talk with those that are stuck, basically, that they don't know what to do. And the last one is how important it is to look at exposures with the real world lens. We are not exposed to one chemical at a time. We are exposed to multiple chemicals constantly, especially with food. And then you add to that, the environmental contaminations. So this is a simple solution here, that is regulate and test chemicals as classes and subclasses. When you regulate a whole entire class of phthalates, let's say all the 28 phthalates that FDA has approved to be used in contact with food as a single class, they will have one safe amount that is not going to be harmful to humans for the entire class, instead of having 28 different safe amounts. So that would bring the exposures to levels of that are much more protective. And this is basically how we ended that manuscript, what we call the Goldilocks rule. That is simply just the right amount of chemical regulation means adopting a balanced approach with a minimum set of standards and with periodic reevaluations. And with that, I thank you, and I will be happy to take questions.
Hi, everybody. There's a box for questions on your screen. Hopefully you can find it. If you can't find it, I don't know what you should do. Hopefully there's a way to communicate with us somewhere there. So we do have one question already, and I'll pose that while others perhaps will add them. Okay, for Dr. Maffini, how are other agencies in the US, besides FDA and EPA, or in other countries, dealing with this?
We have the example in the US of the Consumer Safety Protection Agency. Probably I'm saying it wrong. Consumer Protection Safety, CPSC. That's the acronym, where they have banned the use of 8 orthophthalates, all of which are affecting the normal development of the male reproductive tract in boys. They are not allowed to be used in any products that are marketed for children, from toys to diapers, changing those pads that you use at home to protect when you're changing your babies, anything that padding in daycare facilities, no phthalates are allowed in any of those food products. And that happened It started in 2008, where they banned 3 of those phthalates. So this was during the Bush administration. And then they expanded to a larger number. They recognized that there was no safe levels of those phthalates that children should be exposed to. In Europe, there are some organizations like the European Food Safety Authority, for instance. They are doing now more risk assessment of multiple chemicals at the time to minimize exposures to a whole bunch of them, some of which are endocrine disruptors. The European Food Safety Authority also does assessment of pesticides based on how they affect the endocrine system as well. There's an issue with pesticides, and I think it's related to the power of the corporations that makes pesticides, where those regulations are usually very, very, very delayed. So those are just some examples of other organizations that have actually taken action on endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have another question. Someone thinks that the FDA is undergoing a reorganization of its food programs. Is there hope that they will modernize and follow some of the advice that you're asking for as they reorganize? Will they do a better job with endocrine disruptors, you think?
I hope so.
Okay.
Sorry. The part of the reorganization of FDA involved the establishment of a position that is called a Deputy Commissioner for Human Food. And that individual now has direct oversight on all things chemical safety assessments, related to chemical safety assessment, from additives to industrial chemicals used in packaging to dietary supplements and the like. So his background, he was an EPA official. So he understands chemicals, he understands safety or risk assessment, and he was in charge of putting together some of the pesticide programs at EPA. So I believe there is an opportunity. Previous leadership at EPA, at FDA, were a little shy on trying to make decisions. They are not afraid of being sued by public interest organizations. They're afraid of making decisions that get them to regulate the industry that they have to regulate. So I hope they are following, they will follow a more modern scientific standard and knowledge. And I will see. I will tell you next year.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, what would it cost to really regulate this? Would they need an enormous team of people and enormous budget to really go after these pesticide manufacturers and the food manufacturers who are sneaking this stuff into things we don't even know they're there unless we read the small print with a magnifying glass?
Well, it shouldn't be like that. I think it's important that they hire more people. That is always good. They should be prioritizing chemicals. We don't have to go through a whole list of chemicals one by one. There should be a system of prioritization based on health protection. Mm-hmm. The health protection from endocrine disruptors is going to be different from health protection from other chemicals that don't have an endocrine component, because you will need different experts. Some of the people I know, I came to know over the years, they don't even are sure that endocrine disruption is a thing. They
Yikes.
still question whether or not this is just that the body, basically, the body adapts. Yes, the body adapts until it breaks. So those adaptations are causing things. When you are pregnant, your body has a completely different physiology than when you are a 5-year-old girl or an 82-year-old woman. So having an understanding of that the chemicals actually work like hormones, they know that. But they believe that if they are in food, the body will treat them differently. It is hard to understand. It's like there is some kind of holy water sprinkle on the chemical before it enters the body with the food.
Wow. That's amazing. Okay, one more question so far. What can consumers do to get the attention of the regulatory agencies, including the FDA, about this issue? So if we want to, as citizens, join something, what's the best way to do that?
Call your representative.
Okay, and ask for?
Oversight of the agency.
Okay.
FDA is, there's an oversight committee in the House of Representatives that handles the budget and making sure that you talk to your representatives and you explain your concerns about all these issues in food that are making us sick. The number of chronic diseases is being on the rise for the last 5 decades, and most of them are diet related. And we have a very protective law that was never fully applied or implemented. So just talk with them and make the case for your kids, for your grandkids. We need to protect the future generations. They need to be, healthy, that there is one opportunity to wire the brain. We cannot rewire the brain once we are born. What happens during development is incredibly important. And that is an area that nobody really is paying much attention to.
Wow. And at the other end of the life cycle, are there any specific studies that are looking at old brains and how damaging it is as you get older?
There are some studies on heavy metals, for instance, on especially with lead exposures. And lead is also involved in increased lead, cadmium, and arsenic, actually. There are 3 of them involved with cardiovascular diseases later in life, high risk. But lead also with ADHD in children. Okay. There is some information on that. With the adults, we will just carry with us all the stuff that accumulated in the body. Some of these chemicals, lead stays with us. Cadmium stays with us for decades. And the fluorinated chemicals, I don't even want to know how much I have. There are lots of things that now we are learning just accumulate in the body. They stay there, that the body doesn't eliminate them fast enough. And the whole system of testing for chemicals is based on the assumption that the exposure will be quick, and the body will eliminate the chemical in 24 or 48 hours. Well, for decades we thought that, and now we know that is not the case for many chemicals.
Okay, wow. Well, I don't see any other questions. On behalf of myself and the MBCC board and Cheryl Asimo, MBCC's executive director, I want to thank you, Dr. Maffini, for this super important and informative discussion today. And I want to thank all of our many listeners for joining us. For those interested, the recording of this webinar will be made available later today on the MBCC website at mbcc.org. If you would like to further support our mission of preventing environmental causes of breast cancer, please consider making a donation by visiting mbcc.org/donate. I appreciate your consideration. Wishing everyone a wonderful afternoon. Thank you again, Dr. Maffini.
Thank you, Dr. Dish and MBCC for your great work. Thank you.
Welcome.